The fluorescent lights of the North Ward hummed with a clinical, persistent buzz that usually drowned out the sound of Yuloma's footsteps. She moved with a practiced, deliberate silence. Not the silence of someone hiding, but the silence of someone who had learned that in certain environments, being seen was a liability. At 3:11 a.m., the hospital felt like a submarine submerged in a dark, indifferent ocean. Yuloma adjusted the tension on Mr. Henderson's foreline, her hands steady and sure. Her dark skin looked almost obsidian under the harsh overheads, her face a mask of neutral focus. To the patients, she was a shadow that brought comfort. To the rest of the staff, she was simply a piece of the furniture. Yuloma, are you deaf or just slow? The voice cut through the ward like a jagged blade. Yuloma didn't flinch. She finished securing the tape on the foresight before turning to see Melissa Chavez, the charge nurse, standing by the central station. Melissa's arms were crossed over her designer scrubs, her foot tapping a rhythmic beat of impatience. I asked for the lab results on bed 4 10 minutes ago. Melissa snapped, her voice loud enough to stir a sleeping patient. I know English isn't your first language, but urgent means now in every country. Doesn't it? Yuloma felt the familiar heat rise in her chest. The ghost of a younger, more volatile version of herself wanting to snap back that she was born in D.C. and had served more years in the desert than Melissa had spent in nursing school. Instead, she let the breath out slowly. The labs were uploaded 5 minutes ago, Melissa. I was just finishing with Mr. Henderson. Don't give me excuses, Melissa sighed, turning to Dr. Charles Whitmore, who was leaning against the desk, charting with an air of profound boredom. See what I deal with, Charles? It's like working with a glacier. Dr. Whitmore didn't even look up. He was the kind of man who wore his lab coat like a royal cape, his pedigree from Johns Hopkins practically vibrating off his tailored shoulders. It's the lack of initiative, Whitmore said, his voice smooth and dismissive. Some people are built for the front lines of medicine, and others are just meant to change the linens. Let her be, Melissa. You can't teach hustle to someone who's content being a ghost. They laughed, a sharp, exclusionary sound that echoed off the sterile white walls. Yuloma stood 10 feet away, a clear medical supply case in her hand. She watched them for a heartbeat longer than usual. She saw the way Whitmore's stethoscope hung loosely, the way Melissa's posture was wide and unprotected. Her mind, conditioned by years of threat assessment in places the world forgot, instinctively mapped the room. 2 exits. High ground visibility from the nursing station. Improvised weapons. A heavy stapler, the sharp edge of a metal chart, the paralytics in the locked cabinet. She blinked, and the tactical overlay vanished. She was just a nurse again. I'll go check on the congressman's vitals, Yuloma said quietly. Oh, look at that, Melissa mocked, not looking back. The glacier is moving. Careful. Charles, she might move so fast she trips over her own feet. Yuloma walked away, her posture upright and powerful despite the weight of their words. She reached the heavy double doors of the VIP wing, where Congressman Daniel Harry was being held for observation following a minor procedure. 2 plainclothes security guards stood by the door, their eyes scanning the hallway with a professional lethargy that made Yuloma's skin crawl. They looked at her, saw the blue scrubs and the ID badge, and looked right through her. She entered the room, the silence here even deeper. She checked the monitors, her eyes tracking the jagged green lines of the heart rate. Everything was normal, safe, boring. This was the life she had chosen. The life she had promised her mother she would lead after the medals were tucked away in a box under her bed. She stared at her reflection in the darkened window. She looked small in the oversized scrubs. She looked like exactly what they called her, a quiet, unremarkable ward nurse. Outside, the elevator chimed. It was a normal sound, a routine sound. But Yuloma's ears, tuned to the specific mechanics of machinery, caught the slight, metallic hiss of the doors opening, and the heavy, synchronized footfalls of someone who wasn't walking like a doctor. The silence of the VIP wing was different from the rest of the hospital. It was thick, expensive, and fragile. Yuloma stood by the monitors in Congressman Harry's room, her pulse a steady, rhythmic counterpoint to the electronic beeping. Through the reinforced glass of the observation window, she watched the hallway. The elevator at the far end of the corridor chimed again. A man stepped out. He was dressed in a lab coat that was a fraction too crisp, carrying a clipboard with the practiced ease of a specialist. To Melissa or Dr. Whitmore, he was just another visiting consultant from the surgical wing. But Yuloma's eyes didn't look at the coat. They looked at his feet. He didn't walk with the harried, heel-striking gait of a doctor who had spent 12 hours on his feet. He moved on the balls of his toes, his weight centered, his hips square and stable. It was a soldier's gait, the walk of a man accustomed to carrying weight, a man who navigated terrain with the intent of neutralizing it. Yuloma's world narrowed. The edges of her vision blurred into a tactical gray, highlighting only the essentials. She noted the way his right shoulder dipped slightly, a subconscious compensation for the weight of a concealed sidearm beneath the left flap of his coat. She watched his eyes. They weren't searching for a room number. They were sweeping the ceiling corners, identifying the blind spots of the security cameras with the clinical efficiency of a surveyor. He was a predator in a flock of sheep, and he didn't realize there was a wolf watching from the shadows of the recovery room. Everything all right in here, Yuloma? Or are you just hiding from the real work again? Melissa's voice hissed from the doorway, dripping with its usual acidic condescension. She stepped into the room, smoothing her hair, her eyes immediately darting to the hallway as she caught sight of the newcomer. "Oh, who's that? I didn't see a consult scheduled for the congressman." Yuloma didn't answer. Her gaze was locked on the man in the hallway. He had stopped 10 feet from the security detail. He was smiling, a thin, practiced expression that didn't reach his eyes. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a badge. "Sergeant Emmanuel?" Melissa said, using Yuloma's last name with a sharp, mocking edge. "I'm talking to you. Are you having a stroke or just being difficult?" "Get down, Melissa," Yuloma said. Her voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a low, resonant command, the tone of a senior NCO on a live range. Melissa blinked, her mouth falling open in genuine shock. "Excuse me? Who do you think you're get? Down." Yuloma's hand moved with a sudden, fluid violence. She didn't grab Melissa, she anchored her, pulling the smaller woman behind the heavy oak desk of the monitoring station, just as the man in the hallway reached into his lab coat. He didn't pull out a stethoscope. The air in the hallway seemed to fracture. The man, Viktor Sokolov, didn't hesitate. In one smooth motion, he drew a suppressed pistol. The two security guards, still caught in the lethargy of their routine, didn't even have time to reach for their holsters. Phut, phut. The sound was no louder than a cough, but Yuloma knew exactly what it was. She saw the guards collapse, not like characters in a movie, but like puppets with their strings cut. Sudden. Final. "Oh my God," Melissa whimpered, her face turning a ghostly shade of gray as she peered over the edge of the desk. He just. "Stay quiet and stay low," Yuloma commanded, her eyes never leaving the door. She reached into her clear medical supply case, her fingers closing not on a bandage, but on a heavy, stainless steel tray and a glass vial of high-concentration potassium chloride. The slow nurse was gone. The glacier had arrived. Sokolov stepped over the bodies, his shadow stretching long and dark across the sterile floor. He was coming for the congressman. He thought the floor was clear. He didn't know that the woman in the light blue scrubs was already counting the seconds until his heart was within her reach. Sokolov didn't enter the room like a man expecting a fight. He entered like a man approaching a podium, his confidence rooted in the two bodies cooling in the hallway and the silence of a ward he believed he had already conquered. He pushed the door open with the toe of his boot, his suppressed pistol raised in a low-ready position. From her position behind the heavy oak desk, Yuloma didn't look at the gun. She looked at the man's center of mass. She counted his heartbeats by the rhythm of his breathing. Beside her, Melissa was a frantic mess of shallow gasps, her manicured nails digging into Yuloma's arm. Yuloma didn't feel it. She was back in the heat of a Maiduguri night, where the air tasted of copper and the margin for error was measured in milliseconds. Sokolov's eyes scanned the room, landing on the bed where the congressman lay unconscious. He stepped forward, the floor wax squeaking beneath his tactical saws. That tiny sound was the starter's pistol. Yuloma moved. She didn't stand up, she exploded upward, using the desk for leverage. In her right hand, the stainless steel medical tray wasn't a piece of hospital equipment. It was a kinetic weapon. Sokolov reacted with professional instinct, swinging the muzzle of the suppressed weapon toward the blur of blue scrubs, but he was already behind the curve. The click of the safety being thumbed off echoed in the small room, a sound that should have been followed by a muzzle flash. Instead, it was followed by the wet, heavy thud of steel meeting bone. Yuloma swung the tray edge on, catching Sokolov's wrist with the precision of a guillotine. The pistol didn't just fall, It was launched from his numb fingers. Before the weapon hit the linoleum, Yoloma had closed the gap. She was inside his guard, her shoulder driving into his chest to disrupt his balance. Sokolov's eyes went wide, the predatory coldness replaced by a flickering, panicked confusion. He tried to reach for a combat knife at his belt, but Yoloma's left hand shot out like a piston, her thumb pressing into the brachial plexus pressure point in his neck. His arm went limp. 2 seconds. In the first second, she had neutralized his reach. In the second, she had neutralized his strength. With a fluid, downward spiral, Yoloma grabbed the front of his lab coat and used his own momentum against him. She stepped back, pivoting her hips, and whipped the 200-pound assassin across her center of gravity. Sokolov didn't just fall. He was slammed into the floor with a bone-jarring impact that sent a spray of loose paperwork into the air. He hit the ground with a sickening grunt, the air driven from his lungs. Before he could draw a breath to scream, Yoloma's knee was pinned against his carotid artery, and the glass vial of potassium chloride was pressed against his temple like a detonator. One sound, Yoloma whispered, her voice a terrifying, low vibration that froze the blood in Sokolov's veins. And I'll give you a heart attack that no doctor in this building can reverse. Silence descended on the room, broken only by the frantic, panicked sobbing of Melissa Chavez. The charge nurse crawled out from behind the desk, her eyes bulging as she looked at the scene. The slow nurse, the woman she had mocked for her lack of hustle, was holding a world-class killer pinned to the floor with the casual ease of someone folding laundry. The assassin's assault rifle lay several feet away, sliding across the floor until it tapped against the base of the congressman's bed. Sokolov stared up at Yoloma. His mask of professionalism shattered. He looked at her eyes, not the eyes of a nurse, but the unblinking, lethal eyes of a sergeant who had seen the end of the world and survived it. What are you? Sokolov wheezed, the words barely audible. Yoloma didn't blink. She didn't offer a name. She simply adjusted the pressure of her knee, her gaze shifting to the door. I'm the person who's going to keep you alive long enough to tell me how many more of you are in my hospital. The shadow of the ghost had finally taken form. And for the first time in 3 years, the North Ward was no longer under the command of the doctors. It belonged to the soldier. The heavy thud of Sokolov's body hitting the floor seemed to ripple through the hospital's very foundations. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the frantic, rhythmic beep-beep-beep of Congressman Harry's heart monitor, a fragile metronome in a world that had just gone mad. Then, the hospital's nervous system reacted. High above, a muffled explosion rocked the building, Sokolov's team taking out the primary power grid. The sterile white overheads flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the room into a suffocating, ink-black void. A second later, the emergency generators kicked in with a mechanical groan, and the hallway was bathed in the eerie, rhythmic pulse of crimson light. The code-red lockdown had begun. Yoloma? What's happening? Melissa's voice was a jagged shard of glass, trembling in the dark. Yoloma didn't answer with words. She stripped the zip ties from Sokolov's own tactical vest and secured his wrists behind his back with a jerk so efficient it elicited a sharp groan from the dazed assassin. She rose in one fluid motion, the red emergency lights catching the sharp planes of her face, making her look like a bronze statue of some ancient, vengeful deity. She stepped into the hallway, her boots crunching on the glass of the shattered light fixtures. The North Ward was in chaos. Staff members were spilling out of the break rooms, their faces ghostly in the strobing red light. At the center of the panicked swarm stood Dr. Charles Whitmore. His expensive lab coat was rumpled, and his hands, usually so steady during surgery, were shaking so violently he dropped his tablet. We have to call the police, Whitmore stammered, his voice climbing an octave. The doors are maglocked. We're trapped. I'm a surgeon, I can't. This isn't supposed to happen. As a group of nurses crowded around him, looking for the leadership his title promised, Whitmore's knees buckled. The man who had mocked Yoloma's lack of initiative sank to the floor, his back hitting the nursing station desk, his breath coming in the ragged, useless gulps of a full-blown panic attack. He was a king without a throne, broken by the first sign of a world that didn't follow his rules. Yoloma marched into the center of the fray. She didn't shout, but her voice cut through the panicked, crying like a frequency jammer. Whitmore, get up, she commanded. The doctor looked up, his eyes glazed. Yoloma, you need to hide. There's a man with a gun. The man with the gun is neutralized, she said, her tone as cold as a mountain stream. She reached down, grabbed the lapels of his white coat, and hauled him to his feet. She didn't do it gently. She did it to snap his brain back into his body. Listen to me. The primary power is out, which means the surgical elevators are dead. This wasn't a lone shooter. It's a coordinated hit. Sokolov's backup will be coming up the stairwells within 5 minutes. The staff went silent. Even Melissa, who had stumbled out behind Yuloma, stood frozen. They looked at the slow nurse, seeing for the first time the way she held herself, the absolute stillness of her hands, the tactical sweep of her eyes. Melissa, stop crying, Yuloma ordered, and the charge nurse instinctively snapped her mouth shut. Go to the supply closet. Grab every roll of surgical tape and the heavy-duty trauma shears. Sarah, start moving the non-ambulatory patients into the interior dialysis ward. It's the only room with reinforced doors. Whitmore, you're going to help them. But who put you in charge? Whitmore whispered, a final, pathetic spark of his old arrogance flickering. Yuloma stepped into his personal space, the red light pulsing behind her like a heartbeat. The war did, Charles. Now move, or get out of the way of the people who will. For the first time in his career, the doctor didn't argue. He turned and began to follow Sarah's lead. Yuloma watched them for a split second before turning back to the darkened hallway. She picked up the suppressed pistol she had kicked away earlier, checking the magazine with a metallic snick that sounded like a promise. The hospital was no longer a place of healing. It was a kill zone, and Sergeant Yuloma Emanuel was the only one who knew the layout of the trenches. The red emergency lights strobed against the walls like a slow, bleeding heartbeat. Yuloma stood at the edge of the VIP suite, her eyes scanning the long stretch of the corridor. The kill zone was a 60-foot expanse of open linoleum with nowhere to hide. To a civilian, it was a hallway. To Yuloma, it was a fatal funnel. We can't just walk out there, Dr. Whitmore whispered, his voice cracking as he looked at the 2 fallen guards near the elevator. They'll see us. They'll kill us all. We aren't walking, Yuloma said. She didn't look back at him. She was busy stripping the heavy, lead-lined X-ray aprons from the mobile imaging unit in the corner. She draped them over the sides of Congressman Harry's high-tech gurney, layering them with the precision of a craftsman. We're moving behind a tank. She looked at the congressman. He was still deep under sedation, oblivious to the fact that his life hung by a thread of nylon and 1,000 denier cordura. Yuloma checked the brakes on the gurney and then looked at Melissa and Whitmore. I need you both on the push bars. Stay low. If your head rises above the mattress level, you're dead. Do you understand? Melissa nodded frantically, her hands shaking as she gripped the cold metal rail. Whitmore hesitated, then mimicked her, his expensive watch catching the red light. Now, Yuloma commanded. They burst into the hallway. The heavy gurney groaned as they surged forward. Yuloma didn't push from the back. She moved at the front, one hand guiding the lead-lined frame, the other holding Sokolov's suppressed pistol. She moved in a low, predatory crouch, her boots barely making a sound on the tile. The silence was shattered when a door at the far end of the hall kicked open. 2 figures in dark tactical gear stepped out, their rifle lights cutting through the crimson gloom like lances. Contacts. Down. Yuloma barked. The hallway erupted. The first burst of gunfire wasn't loud, just a series of sharp, metallic snaps, but the impact on the gurney was violent. Thwip thwip thud. The lead aprons absorbed the rounds, the heavy material shuddering under the kinetic energy. Melissa let out a strangled scream but kept her head down, anchored by the sheer gravity of Yuloma's presence. Yuloma didn't spray fire. She waited for the rhythm. She counted the gap between the bursts. In the strobe of the red lights, she saw the lead shooter's muzzle flash. She leaned out from the edge of the gurney for a fraction of a second, a movement so fast it was barely human. Phut. Phut. The lead shooter's light spun wildly as he collapsed. The second shooter scrambled for cover behind a janitor's cart, but Yuloma was already calculating the skip shot. She fired a round into the floor at a shallow angle, the bullet ricocheting off the hard tile and catching the man in the lower leg. He went down with a grunt of agony. Keep moving, Yuloma hissed. Don't stop. They reached the service stairwell door, the gurney slamming into the heavy steel frame. Yuloma kicked the door open, her weapon sweeping the landing. It was clear for now. As they shoved the gurney into the narrow concrete space, Whitmore slumped against the wall, his chest heaving. He looked at the lead-lined aprons. now riddled with jagged holes where the bullets had spent their life. He looked at Yuloma, who was already checking the congressman's pulse with her left hand while her right hand remained locked on the grip of the pistol. You used the X-ray vests as armor, Whitmore breathed, realization dawning on him. He looked at her, his eyes wide with a mix of terror and profound realization. How did you know they would hold? I didn't, Yuloma said, her voice flat and professional. But I knew they'd hold better than your lab coat. She didn't wait for his apology. She looked down the dark throat of the stairwell. The lobby was 3 floors down, and the extraction team would be waiting. The invisible nurse was gone. In her place stood a sergeant who was tired of being quiet. The service stairwell felt like a vertical tomb. The air thick with the smell of damp concrete and the distant metallic echo of boots hitting metal several floors below. Yuloma signaled for Whitmore and Melissa to halt. They stood on the landing of the 2nd floor, the red emergency light casting long, rhythmic shadows that made the cramped space feel like it was breathing. They're coming up, Yuloma whispered. Her eyes were fixed on the gap between the stairs. 3 of them. Heavy footfalls. They aren't worried about being quiet anymore. We have to move, Whitmore hissed, his voice trembling as he leaned against the gurney. If they catch us in this tube, we're trapped. No, Yuloma said, her voice a calm anchor in the dark. If we move now, they'll hear the wheels of the gurney. We make our stand here. She turned to her medical supply case, her movements precise and surgical. To a doctor, the contents were tools of healing. To a ranger, they were the components of a chemical arsenal. She pulled out several vials of succinylcholine, a rapid-onset paralytic used for intubation, and a handful of 10 cubic centimeters syringes. Beside them, she laid out a bottle of high-percentage isopropyl alcohol and a stack of gauze. Whitmore, give me your pen light. Melissa, take these rolls of surgical tape and create a tripwire across the landing, 3 inches off the floor. Do it now. As they worked with fumbling, terrified fingers, Yuloma went to work on the trap. She didn't have explosives, but she understood anatomy. She rigged the syringes into the door's pressurized closing mechanism, taping the plungers so that the moment the door was forced open, the vacuum would depress the needles. She coated the tips with the concentrated paralytic, a dose high enough to stop a man's diaphragm in seconds. Next, she saturated a long trail of gauze with the alcohol, stretching it from the landing's light fixture down to a puddle of floor stripper she had poured near the entrance. It was a primitive incendiary, a flash trap designed to disorient and blind. Get behind the gurney, Yuloma commanded, her voice dropping to a low, lethal vibration. And cover your eyes. The sound of the stairwell door on the floor below slamming open echoed upward. The heavy, rhythmic thud of tactical boots grew louder, closer. Yuloma stood in the center of the landing, a shadow among shadows. She wasn't holding the gun. She was holding a heavy 4-pole like a spear. Her weight balanced on the balls of her feet. The door handle to the 2nd floor landing jiggled. Then, a violent kick sent the door flying inward. The pressurized trap triggered instantly. A fine mist of succinylcholine sprayed into the lead mercenary's face, just as he tripped over Melissa's surgical tape wire. He went down hard, his rifle clattering against the concrete. His partner stepped over him, raising a weapon, but Yuloma was already moving. She struck the pen light against the alcohol-soaked gauze. A brilliant, blue-white flash erupted in the narrow space. The fumes of the floor stripper igniting in a controlled burst of heat and light. The mercenaries screamed, blinded by the sudden flare and the stinging chemical vapor. In the confusion, Yuloma stepped forward. She didn't use the gun. She didn't want the noise to draw the rest of the team. She used the 4-pole, striking with a calculated ferocity that targeted the soft tissues of the throat and the nerve clusters of the inner thigh. The man who had been sprayed with the paralytic began to gasp, his muscles locking up as the drug hit his system. He slumped against the wall, his eyes wide and vacant as his lungs forgot how to pull air. The second man, blinded and reeling, felt the cold weight of the 4-pole shatter his kneecap before Yuloma's fist connected with his temple, sending him into a deep, dark unconsciousness. The fire flickered out as quickly as it had started, leaving the landing smelling of scorched chemicals and sweat. Yuloma stood over the 3 downed men, her breathing even, her scrubs barely wrinkled. Melissa looked out from behind the gurney, her face pale. You used the intubation meds? You paralyzed him? He's still breathing, Yuloma said, checking the pulse of the man on the floor with a clinical detachment. For now. But he won't be holding a rifle for a long time. She looked at Whitmore, who was staring at the syringes taped to the door. The doctor, who prided himself on knowing every inch of the human body, looked like he was seeing it for the first time through the eyes of a soldier. "The lobby is next," Yoloma said, reloading the suppressed pistol. "And they won't be sending the B-team this time." The descent into the mechanical floor felt like stepping into the iron bowels of a leviathan. Yoloma led them through a heavy steel hatch and into a world of thrumming vibration, where massive HVAC ducts snaked like silver pythons and steam pipes hissed with a rhythmic, industrial breath. The red emergency strobes didn't reach down here. The only light came from the orange glow of pressure gauges and the occasional spark of a short-circuiting control panel. "Stay on the catwalk," Yoloma whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the ventilation fans. "The grating is loud, so step on the support beams. Heel to toe. Keep the gurney's weight distributed." Dr. Whitmore was a ghost of the man who had walked the halls an hour ago. He gripped the metal rail until his knuckles were white, his eyes darting toward the shadows between the massive boilers. "It's a maze," he breathed. "If they find us here, there's no way out." "That's the point," Yoloma replied, her eyes scanning the ceiling height. She wasn't just looking for an exit. She was looking for tactical advantages. She knew the blueprints of this hospital better than the architect. While the others saw a basement, she saw a 3D grid of vents and voids, the invisible spaces she had studied during her first week on the job. A sharp, metallic clack echoed from the far end of the mechanical floor. Yoloma froze, her hand snapping up in a silent signal. Whitmore and Melissa went rigid, their breath hitching. From the darkness beyond the secondary cooling tower, a sweep of a high-intensity flashlight cut through the gloom. Then another. "There in the voids," Yoloma hissed. The mercenaries had realized the stairs were a trap. They were using the maintenance shafts to bypass the lockdown gates. Yoloma watched the movement of the lights, 3 of them, spread out in a pincer formation. They were moving with professional discipline, checking the shadows beneath the pipes. "We can't outrun them with the gurney," Melissa whimpered, her voice trembling. "We aren't running," Yoloma said. She looked at the massive steam release valve to their left, and then at the overhead ventilation duct. "We're going to vanish." She directed Whitmore and Melissa to shove the gurney into a recessed alcove behind a series of heavy electrical transformers. The lead-lined aprons acted as a perfect dampener for any heat signatures. Then, Yoloma climbed the maintenance ladder with the agility of a mountain cat, disappearing into the dark maw of a primary air duct. The mercenaries approached the catwalk, their boots clanging softly on the metal. "Clear left," one whispered into his comms. Suddenly, a rhythmic tapping began, a hollow metallic sound coming from the ceiling 40 feet behind them. The 3 lights swung upward in unison. Movement in the vents. The lead mercenary barked. As they moved toward the sound, Yoloma dropped from a service pipe directly behind the trailing man. She didn't use her gun. She used the environment. She grabbed a loose steam vent tether and looped it around his throat, using her body weight to pull him into the dark gap between 2 boilers. There was no struggle, only the muffled hiss of the pipes drowning out his final gasp. The other 2 spun around, their lights dancing wildly across the iron forest. "Vance, where are you?" one shouted, the first note of genuine fear creeping into his voice. Yoloma's voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the curved metal surfaces. "You're in my ward now," she whispered, a chilling, disembodied sound. She didn't stay to finish them. She slid back to the gurney, her face a mask of cold efficiency. "Move. Now." The vibration from the cooling fans will mask our exit. They pushed the gurney toward the heavy freight elevator, the only one on a dedicated emergency circuit. As the doors groaned open, Yoloma looked back into the dark maze. 2 lights were still searching, flicking desperately through the voids. But the predator they were hunting was already gone, moving her patience toward the final confrontation. The freight elevator groaned to a halt at the basement level, opening into the cavernous silence of the hospital's central supply warehouse. It was a forest of towering steel shelving, stacked 10 feet high with crates of saline, surgical kits, and oxygen canisters. The air was colder here, smelling of cardboard and industrial ozone. "We're almost at the loading dock," Yoloma whispered, checking the corridor. "Once we're through those doors, the congressman is in the hands of the perimeter team." But as the gurney cleared the elevator doors, a high-intensity flare hissed into life at the far end of the warehouse, bathing the aisles in a blinding, magnesium-white glare. "That's far enough. Sergeant." Viktor Sokolov's voice echoed through the rafters. He had escaped his restraints or been cut loose by his men. He stood 50 feet away, flanked by the final 4 members of his extraction team. They were fanned out in a tactical line, weapons raised, blocking the only exit to the surface. Sokolov held a detonator in his left hand, his face bruised and twisted with a primal, wounded pride. "You're a ghost, Emmanuel," Sokolov called out, his voice bouncing off the metal crates. "A relic of a war that's over. Give us the congressman, and I might let the doctors live." Dr. Whitmore collapsed behind the gurney, his breath coming in ragged hitches. Melissa was frozen, her hands locked on the metal rail. They looked to Yuloma, but she wasn't looking at the gunman. She was looking at the environment. She saw the heavy-duty chains hanging from the overhead hoists, the canisters of pressurized oxygen, and the slick sheen of floor sealant nearby. "The war isn't over," Yuloma said, her voice dropping into a register that made the hair on Whitmore's neck stand up. "It just moved locations." She didn't reach for her pistol. She reached for the lever of the heavy industrial shelving unit beside her. With a sudden, violent yank, she sheared the safety pin. "Get down," she roared. As the massive shelf groaned and began a slow, catastrophic tilt, Yuloma moved. She was a blur of blue scrubs and focused intent. As hundreds of pounds of medical supplies cascaded toward the floor, creating a wall of debris and dust, the mercenaries opened fire. The warehouse erupted in the deafening thunder of unsuppressed rifles, but the falling crates provided a shifting, chaotic shield. Yuloma didn't run away from the fire. She ran into it. She used the falling shelves as a staircase, leaping onto a mid-level rack and swinging herself upward onto the high-speed conveyor rail. She moved like a shadow in the rafters, her ranger training taking over. She dropped from the ceiling directly behind the first shooter. In one fluid motion, she used her trauma shears to sever the strap of his tactical vest, spinning him into the path of his own teammates' fire. Before the second man could adjust his aim, Yuloma was on him. She didn't strike like a nurse, she struck like a combatant. A series of palm-heeled strikes to the solar plexus, and a brutal knee to the sternum that collapsed his lung. Sokolov screamed in order, swinging his rifle upward. But Yuloma had already vanished back into the rows of shelving. She appeared again 10 feet to his left, sliding beneath a forklift. She grabbed a pressurized oxygen tank, kicked the valve assembly against a steel upright to shear it off, and launched it like a torpedo across the concrete floor. The tank hissed with terrifying force, spinning into the final 2 mercenaries and knocking them off their feet like bowling pins. Then, there was only Sokolov. He dropped his empty rifle and drew a serrated combat knife, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Come on then, Sergeant. Show me the war machine." Yuloma stepped out from the shadows. She didn't have a knife. She held nothing but a length of heavy-duty traction wire she'd pulled from a nearby orthopedic kit. The struggle was brief and absolute. Sokolov lunged with the desperation of a dying animal, but Yuloma's movement was economy in motion. She parried the blade with the metal casing of her supply tray, stepped into his pivot, and looped the wire around his wrist and throat in a complex, inescapable binding. With a sharp, practiced twist, she sent him to his knees. She stood over him as the distant wail of police sirens finally began to pierce the warehouse walls. Her face was calm, her breathing barely elevated. "The mission is over," Yuloma said, her voice a cold, final gavel. She didn't look back at the broken men behind her. She turned and walked toward Whitmore and Melissa, who were staring at her with a terrifying new brand of awe. The invisible nurse was dead. The sergeant had returned. The sun rose over the city in a pale, apologetic gray, casting long shadows across the debris-strewn loading dock. The sirens had faded into a dull, rhythmic pulse of blue and red as federal agents and local police processed the scene. Yuloma stood by the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over her shoulders that she didn't really need. Her scrubs were torn at the shoulder and stained with a cocktail of drywall dust and antiseptic, but her hands were perfectly still as she held a lukewarm cup of coffee. The hospital wasn't the same place it had been 8 hours ago. The air felt heavier, charged with the lingering electricity of what had unfolded in the dark. A shadow fell over her, and she didn't need to turn to know who it was. Dr. Charles Whitmore approached with a slow, hesitant gait. Gone was the regal stride and the cape-like lab coat. He looked small. His shirt rumpled, and his face etched with the exhaustion of a man who had seen his own soul and found it wanting. He stopped a respectful distance away, his eyes fixed on the pavement. "The congressman is stable," Whitmore said, his voice stripped of its usual bravado. The surgical team at West Side took over. They said the lead lining on the gurney was the only reason he didn't take a round to the chest. Yoloma took a slow sip of her coffee, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "He was my patient, Charles. I don't lose patience." Whitmore cleared his throat, a sound of genuine discomfort. "Yoloma, about the things I said, the way I spoke to you. I didn't know. I had no idea who you were." Yoloma finally turned her head, her dark eyes meeting his with a level of intensity that made him recoil slightly. "That's the problem, isn't it? You didn't need to know I was a sergeant to treat me like a human being. You shouldn't need to see someone bleed to believe they have value." The silence that followed wasn't the dismissive quiet of the previous morning. It was the heavy, humbling silence of a man realizing he had been blind. Whitmore nodded slowly, unable to find a retort. He simply turned and walked back toward the hospital. His shoulders no longer squared, but bowed. Inside the ward, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. As Yoloma walked through the double doors, the usual morning chatter died instantly. Nurses paused mid-chart, orderlies stopped their carts. Melissa Chavez was standing by the central station, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, but when she saw Yoloma, she stood up straight. She didn't offer a snide remark or a mocking laugh. She simply stepped aside, clearing a path to the lead trauma coordinator's desk. The hospital board had already made the call. The paperwork was still being drafted, but the reality was already written in the way the staff looked at her. They didn't look through her anymore. They looked at her with a mixture of fear, awe, and a burgeoning, fierce loyalty. Yoloma reached the station and set her coffee down. She pulled a new ID badge from her pocket. It didn't say ward nurse anymore. It read, Yoloma Emanuel, lead trauma coordinator. She clipped it to her scrubs, the plastic snapping into place with a definitive click. She looked around the ward, her eyes scanning the monitors, the 4 stands, and the faces of her team. She saw their uncertainty, their trauma, and their need for a steady hand. "The shift is starting," Yoloma said, her voice resonant and clear, echoing with the authority of someone who had commanded in the Valley of the Shadow. "Mr. Henderson needs a fresh dressing, and I want a full vitals sweep on the recovery wing. We have work to do." The staff moved. There was no grumbling, no hesitation, and no laughter. There was only the synchronized, efficient movement of a unit that had found its leader. Yoloma watched them for a moment, then turned to her monitor, her posture upright and powerful. The ghost was gone. The soldier had found a new front line, and this time, everyone knew exactly who was standing guard.